Welcome back to Daisy Asks. Thanks for joining me for another Delphi video. Today we're going to return to the Toolmark analysis because I still hear people talking about how Richard Allen's gun matched the unspent round at the crime scene. And because Toolmark analysis itself is a scientific method that has been well researched, people take the leap to believing that how it was employed in this case, in the flawed case against Richard Allen, was also validated. But, spoiler alert, it wasn't. I've done a really lengthy video on the toolmark analysis evidence and why it's problematic, and I'm going to play that as the second part of today's video. But before we get into the lengthier video, I'm just going to give a little bit of a summary, a little bit of a TLDR on why unspent round firearm comparisons are not validated science. So what's the assumption behind this type of comparison? Well, people assume that if a gun leaves unique marks when it fires a round, it must also leave unique marks when a round is chambered or extracted. And so we should be able to match an unfired round to a fired one and then back to the gun. And whilst this assumption feels intuitive, it's not evidence. And in forensic science, intuition has led to serious errors before. Let's go through the problems with this analysis. First of all, we're comparing two completely different processes. A fired round and an unfired round do not experience the same physical events. A fired cartridge case is marked by the firing pin, the breech face, high pressure expansion, heat, elastic and plastic deformation. An unfired round may experience light contact with the feed ramp, possible extractor or ejector contact, brief chambering friction, and these are not comparable mechanisms. The marks are different in source, different in force, different in stability, different in reproducibility, and comparing them is not like comparing two fingerprints. It's more like, as the defense expert said, comparing apples with oranges. The second problem is that unfired rounds rarely carry stable individual marks. Even when unfired rounds do have marks, research and examiner guidance consistently show that many unfired rounds show no usable marks at all, and marks that do exist are often inconsistent, incomplete, easily altered by rechambering. The same gun can leave different marks on unfired rounds, and different guns can leave similar marks. This means the core requirement of forensic identification, repeatable, distinctive features, is often missing. At best, unfired rounds support class-level consistency. They do not support individualization. We know this is the case when it comes to the round found at the Delphi crime scene and the toolmark analysis conducted by Melissa Oberg, because remember, she attempts to compare unspent rounds chambered through Richard Allen's gun with the round found at the crime scene and is unable to find a match. The third problem, even unfired to unfired comparisons are unreliable. And this is important. So even when examiners compared unfired round A to unfired round B from the same firearm, results are often inconclusive, examiner dependent, and highly subjective. Now we know that because that's exactly what happens when Melissa Oberg tries to do the exact task we've just discussed. What the research shows is that there isn't very much research on comparisons of unfired rounds to begin with. And when these comparisons are made, agreement between examiners is low, reproducibility is poor, and confidence varies widely. If unfired to unfired comparisons already struggle, then extending that comparison across different evidence types, unfired to fired, is a scientific leap, and it's not a validated method. The fourth problem, there are no error rate studies, and this again is critical. For a forensic method to be scientifically valid, we need to know how often it gets things right. We can't just rely upon the examiner's comment that she's always right and she's never been wrong, because that there would be subject to confirmation bias. In order for forensic method to be scientifically valid, we need to know how often it gets things right, how often it gets things wrong, and under what conditions it fails. And for unfired round firearm comparisons, there are no large-scale black box studies, no blind testing, no published error rates, no likelihood ratios, no validated decision thresholds. Now, studies of comparisons of fired rounds are evidence-based. They have been researched in lengthy, reproducible studies, but the comparison of unspent to unspent is pretty much missing from the research. But let's go one step even further. The comparison of unspent rounds to fired rounds is completely missing from the research. And without error rates, confidence statements are meaningless. You can't say this matches if you don't know. The fifth problem. Yes, we've got more problems. Examiner judgment fills the gaps. When the science is thin, human judgment fills the space. And that means conclusions depend on the examiner's experience, their expectations, their interpretation thresholds, contextual information. And decades of cognitive science research shows that this increases overconfidence, inconsistency, and the risk of confirmation bias. And that doesn't require bad faith, but it happens automatically when methods aren't constrained by data. So, the bottom line, comparing an unspent round to a fired round in order to identify a specific firearm is not supported by robust empirical research. It relies on different physical mechanisms, lacks known error rates, depends heavily on subjective interpretation, and exceeds what the science can honestly support. So at most, unfired rounds can provide limited contextual or class information. They cannot reliably identify a specific gun. And when forensic conclusions go beyond what the science can support, the risk isn't just error, it's injustice. So without further ado, I'm going to replay the more lengthy video that I did several months ago, looking specifically at the Toolmark analysis in the Delphi case. Hello, lovely people. Thank you for tuning in again for another episode of our series on Richard Allen, the flawed case against him, the Delphi murders. Today, we're going to deep dive into the Toolmark analysis and really explore the myth of the matching gun, because really it is a myth. But before we do that and go into more detail around the evidence, I just want to introduce you guys to the website that I just launched, which is called the Richard Allen Justice Project. So the reason that I decided to launch a website is to basically have a hub for all of the make a informed decision about Rick Allen. Okay. So let's get to the myth of the matching gun, the Toolmark analysis. So I'm just going to pull it up on the screen. So going into today's presentation, this is something I've been working on for a few weeks. It took me a while to get my head around stuff. There are a few areas that I misinterpreted initially, got super excited, posted some stuff on X, and then deleted it subsequently. So anyone who saw those, sorry for that. I got excited. I thought and I'd figured some stuff out that could be helpful. But luckily I double-checked my work, and I had made some inaccurate points. So I've double-checked it, triple-checked it. I think that everything in here now is matching with factual evidence and research. Of course, as I said before, if you find anything in here that seems incorrect, let me know. We can always evolve these presentations to make them more accurate, as I have done in the past. So for me, I understood that this gun bullet evidence was not solid
after the trial, I'd heard people explain that when we're comparing an unspent round to a fired round, that is comparing apples and oranges. And so I knew, I guess, that fundamentally this was quite a flawed analysis, and this evidence was certainly not as ironclad as the prosecution made it out to be, and as a lot of people who believe Rick Allen's guilty make it out to be. But I didn't know exactly the science behind it all, the whys behind it being so problematic. And I certainly didn't realize some other angles that have kind of been exposed as I've done more research into what was actually done in this case. So there's a lot, and this is super concerning. As somebody who has studied a very research-dense science, that is psychology, I could not believe the methodology and the conclusions in this case were allowed in a court of law, because if I submitted research like this for an honours thesis in psychology, I would fail. It's so flawed from a methodological perspective, from an interpretive perspective. There are issues here. So let's dive in. So I always give the same disclaimer. It's super important to know that this presentation is for education and discussion purposes only. I am not a legal consultant. I'm not a law enforcement agent. I have no experience in law or law enforcement, and I'm not a forensic expert. Certainly not an expert when it comes to the science of toolmark analysis. And so everything here is information I've gathered from my own research, looking at publicly available information, looking at journal articles, and just doing research, using some AI for sure to try and decode stuff that doesn't really make sense to me, and then double and triple checking that, because we all know that AI likes to tell little porkies at times. So anything that I state here is based on all of that. There could still be errors in this, so please let me know if I do misspeak at any point. So toolmark analysis is widely used, but key aspects like error rates and reproducibility are contested. So it is a science. There is some research to back it up. It has been used quite widely in court, in legal proceedings, but there's certainly been some skepticism. But in this case, it goes even beyond that, because in this case, the method departs completely from the best practice when it comes to toolmark analysis. So, it's incredibly flawed. So today's agenda, what is toolmark analysis? So I've already mentioned it a couple of times today. I think the majority of you watching this video probably understand to some extent the gist of what toolmark analysis is. But if you're new to the case, if you haven't heard about it, don't worry. We're going to explain it very quickly in easy to digest terms. We're going to look at how it was used in the case against Rick Allen. We're going to look at what constitutes strong versus weak evidence when it comes to this field. We're going to look at the major issues when it comes to how it was used here in this case. We're going to look at how the defense used it, challenged it during the trial. And we're going to look at a recent appellate decision that I have to credit my wonderful friend Diana for, because she sent this link to me. So there's been a recent decision around toolmark analysis, which I think is super, super important when we look at Rick's case. So let's jump in. For anyone new as well to my channel, the reason that I use slides like this, and it almost is like a lecture format, is not, like I said, because I'm a teacher, but it's because this helps me to stay organized and on track. And I hope that it helps the information be more easily digested. I hope that it doesn't seem like I'm trying to be a lecturer. I'm really just trying to open a discussion around this. So yeah. Okay, so the unspent round. So why does toolmark analysis even matter for the Delphi murders? Because the gun was not the murder weapon. And that's because an unspent round was, in fact, found at the crime scene. Now, an unspent round is basically the round of ammunition that has not been fired from a gun. And so in this case, this round was found near the girls' bodies, and it had been cycled through the gun and ejected but not fired. Okay, so it's been racked and it's come out of the gun, but it hasn't been fired. And that's why it's called an unspent round. So the state in this case argued that this unspent round came from Richard Allen's gun. So it was argued that this piece of evidence linked Rick Allen directly to the crime scene. Now, this sounds really big on the surface, right? If you don't look into this any deeper, you go, well, case closed. If that bullet matched his gun and the crime scene is not on the main trail, then it's most likely that it has to be somebody involved in the crime that dropped it there. You know, it's not this frequently walked space. It's not part of the main trail where we could say, well, you know, he could have dropped it on another day, or, you know, he could have been hunting or doing something else there. No, it's in the location of the crime scene, which is quite a way off the main track. And so, yes, it sounds incredibly damning. However, the issue here is the science that matched that unspent round to Rick Allen's gun is absolutely in question, particularly in how it's applied to this case. Okay, you know my conclusion already, but let's actually get into the bare bones. So what is toolmark analysis? It's a forensic process to examine the microscopic marks left on bullets and cartridge cases by a firearm. The purpose is to determine if bullets or casings found at a crime scene came from a specific firearm. And how is it done? Well, the primary method used is called comparison microscopy. So it involves two microscopes side by side, and you'll see them here, that you use to visually compare the marks, the little indents and marks microscopically on the evidence with test-fired rounds. So they get the gun, they test fire some rounds of ammunition, and then they put those rounds under one microscope, and on the other microscope, they put the round in question. So the round found at a crime scene, for example, and they compare and see if there is enough agreement in terms of how they look, in terms of those microscopic marks. Do they look largely the same? So guns leave specific marks on bullets, and some of those marks can happen from a whole lot of guns, and some of them can happen from a smaller subset of guns, and some of them are individual aspects related to a specific gun. We're going to go into more detail about that, but that's kind of the gist of it. So it is used widely in courts, but its standard validity and error rates are debated. So there is debate around this. It's not as slam dunk as it sounds. So how are marks made? There's a variety of different marks that are made. Some of the primary marks, these are the gold standard. These are the ones that are more relied upon in the research when it comes to matching a gun to a round, are things like breech face, which is a unique pattern impressed on the case head during firing. Barrel rifling, so this leaves grooves and striations on bullets. Firing pin, which leaves impressions on primers. We've then got the secondary. So these are less validated. They're more used as supportive evidence. So if you've got the primary evidence, and if there's anything maybe vague or unclear, or even if it is clear, the secondary information can support that conclusion. The more things that match between the test-fired round and the crime scene round, the more likely it is that this has come from the same weapon. And so these are things like the extractor or ejector marks. So these are two separate things, extractor and ejector. So they both leave marks as the cartridge is loaded and removed. So you can see, don't need necessarily to fire the gun to get some marks in this area. We've got chamber striations, chamber marks, which are striations on case walls from expansion against machining marks. Don't worry if you don't understand all of these bits. I don't understand all of the parts of the gun. We will look at the picture that Oberg, who is the state's expert, provided. But yeah, don't need to know the specifics of each mark. We just need to know what the research shows and what was shown in this case. And then finally, we've got some really weak marks. I don't mean that the marks themselves are weak, but they're weak in terms of evidence, and that's to do with the magazine lips and the slide. So with the magazine lips and the slide, these are things that have not been researched. So they could be a mark that you could consider. However, we don't know whether they're particularly accurate in identifying a match. So these are the parts inside a firearm. I've taken this from the State's Exhibit 279, Oberg's PowerPoint presentation. If you want to look at the full presentation, it is available. Have a look on All Eyes on Delphi's website, because all of the exhibits that are available are easy to download from there. And you can look at her entire PowerPoint presentation, which explains even some of this stuff as well. So it'll give you some detailed information on that. So yeah, these are just some of the different areas: slide, chamber face, chamber, breech face. So it's kind of showing you where those marks are kind of made. You've got ejector, there, an extractor there. And yeah, so that's just for reference if you really need to know where these different marks come from. So this is probably a really important point, and this is on Oberg's slides as well. And this is explaining the sort of layers of similarity that can occur when guns leave impressions on the rounds. So the class characteristics are broad design level features that all firearms of a make or model share. So if you have two guns of the same make and model and they fire around, they're going to match on certain characteristics. These are called class characteristics. So these can help maybe narrow down the type of gun used, but they can't narrow down exactly which gun in that class is responsible for firing the bullet. Okay, so that's like saying these footprints were made by Nike shoes, maybe even the style of Nike shoe, but we don't know whether it's Amy's Nike shoe or Diana's Nike shoe, because there isn't something specific to show us that. Subclass characteristics, now we're going down a level to getting more specific, and they are marks transferred during manufacture. So basically, if parts of the gun or the guns are manufactured around the same time in the same facility in the same batch, they will share some similarity too. So now we can say, well, it's not just the Nike particular shoe, it's a Nike particular shoe made on July 25th in this particular factory, but you're still going to get a batch there, so we've got then maybe, let's say the factory makes 100 of those shoes on that day, and I don't know if it's even to do with the day. It could be like during manufacture, could be like a period of months of manufacturing, I suppose. But basically it's narrowing it down a little bit further, but it's not narrowing it down to the point where we could again conclusively say, well, that's Amy's shoes. Amy's shoes were made on that day, but so were so many other people's. So what we're really wanting to look at is this final layer, which is called individual characteristics. So these are random imperfections from wear, use, damage. So again, taking my shoe analogy. So let's say Diana and I have the same shoes made at the same factory on the same day. We went and bought them together at the shop. They're the same size. Don't know what size shoes Diana wears and whether they're the same as me. Who knows? But let's say for the sake of this conversation that is what is happening. Well, Diana's worn her shoes on gravel at the gym. She's walked through mud. I might have worn mine in sand or on ice or whatever. And so basically we're going to have slightly different marks based on where we've walked in those shoes, based on how we walk. I always wear out the soles of my shoes, particularly the heel, much quicker than other people. It must be something to do with my gait. So you would then be able to look at this shoe print. Yes, it matches overall this brand of shoe. It matches overall this brand of shoe that was made in this factory. But actually there's some marks specifically on here, and these match up with marks on Amy's shoes. Okay, so these are the characteristics that we're looking for. So these are the practical steps that an analyst should take. They should test multiple rounds fired or cycled from the same gun. They need to be able to check reproducibility. It's a hard word to pronounce, but you can't just get one footprint and go, yep, that one footprint matches the shoe. You really want to be able to look at multiple so that you can say, well, actually, this it's reliable over again. We're getting the same result. And that's with most science. You know, there's no point thinking something's only accurate once. How do we know it's always accurate? So we would need to do multiple. We need to compare to known exemplars from other guns of the same make model, if available, to see if the feature is widely shared. So ideally, in the case of guns now, and actually, let's go back to my shoe example. If we're going to say that footprint is made by Amy's Nike shoe, that's fine. But have you looked at any other Nike shoes in that same brand and size to see that the markings on that footprint are individual to Amy's shoe, or are they just the normal markings we would see on any shoe of that size? So with the guns, if we've got a Sig Sauer, I think, I'm not going to remember the numbers in this one, but I think it's like a 239 or 26 something, you would ideally have another Sig Sauer of that exact model and test fire rounds from that as well, to see, again, that idea around class and subclass characteristics. So there is a time factor. So subclass features often diminish with wear, but individual features persist but evolve uniquely. So the subclass features, of course, are going to diminish. Again, taking my footprint example, you know, shoes start to wear out. So some of those features like the little Nike tick on the bottom of the shoe, that could get sort of ground down over time as we're walking, and so it may not leave such a strong impression. But when it comes to individual features, they will persist over time, and they may evolve, because, you know, if I wear my shoes more often, they're going to get more worn down, or, you know, if I step in a rock and a rock kind of makes a little kind of dent in the shoe, then that may persist, but it might be a new dent that wasn't there before I walked on that rock. And so the same happens with our guns. There's going to be wear and tear, there's going to be changes, because guns get wiped, washed, fire bullets, maybe get thrown in a bag, maybe dust goes into them. I don't know. I've never had a gun. We have very strict gun laws here in Australia, and I don't personally really want a gun. So I don't know enough about what the wear and tear on a gun would be. Feel free to chime in if you guys understand what wear and tear there could be on a gun, if you've ever held a gun or had a gun. And then peer review is important. So a second examiner should independently assess whether features look like batch or tooling patterns versus random wear. So again, I mean, this is again in any science, you're usually going to want to see, does somebody else who's kind of blind, independent, like as in blind to the findings that I made, and independent, see the same thing that I see? Because if they don't, then that suggests, you know, there may be error there. Obviously, the more people you check, the better, because you're then going to be able to see, do more of us agree? There are actually, I believe, now some digital ways that they're working on for Toolmark analysis, so that they can have more of a objective measure, because this is incredibly subjective. You're looking at a microscope, you're using your own eyes, and I'm not suggesting that you know, science can't sometimes be or have elements of subjectivity. Of course, you know, the science that I work in, psychology, definitely does have some of that. But if we can get ways to make it more objective, of course, we're going to do that. And they've been doing this in science in lots of areas. I know for myself, having had breast cancer, when they did the histopathology on the tumours, they count different things, like there are cells that they count in terms of grading the cancer and looking at certain features, and there's definitely variability. I saw variability between biopsy and full tumour, which can be to do with the sample, but also even two raters can see it slightly differently, and so they're doing the very same thing, trying to get more digital tools that can kind of be a more objective measure. Okay, so let's now apply this to Rick's case. So the Toolberg, I'm combining Toolmark and Oberg. So the Toolmark analysis was conducted by Melissa Oberg. She was the state's expert witness. And if you want to find out more about Melissa Oberg, what her experience is, where she's trained, where she was working, I believe she worked with the ISP at some point. She wasn't working with them at this point, but she had previously. And I believe she's a forensic scientist. You can find that information. That is one of the exhibits, her qualifications. So you can look into that. So basically, she used, as far as I'm aware, 10 rounds of ammunition, similar to the unspent round found at the crime scene. And she used Rick's gun, and she cycled 6 of those rounds, which means she didn't fire them. And she fired 4 rounds, and she compared all of those 10 rounds to the unspent round found at the crime scene. Now, what she found was that the 6 cycled rounds, the 6 unspent rounds from Rick's gun, they were cycled through his gun, did not match. They did not have a sufficient match. They're just, the marks were vague and weak, which is often the case when you cycle rounds rather than fire them, and there was no match. So she proceeded to use test-fired rounds. So this is where she fired 4 rounds, and then she compared those 4 rounds to the unspent round. Now you can see here, this is where the problem arises, because a spent round and an unspent round are not the same thing. When a gun is fired, there is more pressure and force on it, and it leaves deep extraction marks and deep tool marks, I suppose. And so it's hard to really understand how you can compare those two, but we'll get into that a little bit later. So she said, based on sufficient agreement of quality and quantity of marks observed on 3 tool mark zones, that is the ejector mark, the extractor mark, and the chamber face, that it was a match to Rick's gun. So she also did have a second independent person in the lab have a look, and that person agreed with her findings. I believe that second person was a colleague of hers. So I've got TLDR here. She said the cycled unspent round found at the crime scene had come from Rick Allen's 6-hour gun. Now, first of all, like I said, we've got the apple and oranges thing, which we'll get into a little bit later. But secondly, if you look at the zones, ejector, extractor, chamber face, and we go back here, it fits in here. The secondary, less validated. It isn't the gold standard. Now, part of the reason for that is that the gold standard is all based on fired rounds. You don't get this if you don't fire a round. You're not going to get strong markings in these areas. So already we're dealing with evidence that is from this secondary category. It's less supported. And we're also dealing with the fact that we're now comparing a fired round to an unspent round. So in terms of ruling out class and subclass characteristics, Oberg directly observed subclass characteristics on the ejector and noted their presence in her report and testimony. So we go back here and we look at ejector. So this was one of the areas she said there was sufficient agreement, but there were subclass characteristics. So if we go back to what subclass characteristics means, it's that there would be other guns with parts from the same tooling batch, so the same manufacturing, that would show similar micro marks. So this is not really something that we can then say, well, that's definitely Rick's gun. We can say, okay, that's most likely a gun like Rick's that was manufactured in a similar manner from the similar manufacturer at a similar time. That's not particularly conclusive. So she exercised caution. She said there were definitely subclass characteristics present on the ejector itself, and so she did not feel comfortable in this case drawing only conclusions on the ejector mark alone. Okay, fair enough. So then she went to the extractor, and she could not fully exclude subclass, stating she couldn't directly observe the working surface, but found the striated portion, supporting individualization. So she said, again, there were some subclass characteristics, but she did feel that there were certain striations that did support the idea that this was an individual match to Rick's gun. She noted only general pressure for subclass presence, but found striated individual features. So saying the same thing, just worded a little bit more smoothly. For the chamber face, which is also known as the barrel hood, she admitted there was little to no peer-reviewed subclass research, and her conclusions hinged on the observed milling process and the specific configuration. So she asserted that multiple tool marks and areas were compared to reduce error from subclass effects, and her reliance on all three tool marks was meant to increase certainty that the matches weren't from generic subclass features. So I guess what she's saying here is, the more similarities I find, the more likely it is, the probability is higher that this is a match, which makes sense, yes, because we're saying, how likely is it that all three of these marks are going to align, I suppose. But I don't actually know, because, if they're manufactured in the same factory at the same time, then surely all those subclass errors would be part of any gun made in that factory at the same time. But she did suggest that there were some individual marks that she could base her conclusion on. Big issue here, like I said, is this is secondary evidence. This is weak. Here we've got little to no peer-reviewed subclass research. How is she figuring this out? So as the crime scene round was an unspent round, there were no rifling striations, no firing pin strike, no pressure-based breech face details. So all those strong features, those primary gold standard features, the ones that the research is based on, the one where the error rates are low, none of them were present. So the match was based on secondary and weak characteristics only. And this is a big issue, because when people quote the error rates for this, they say things like, there's only like less than 2% false positives and something similar with false negatives. It seems like it's this incredibly accurate science. And perhaps it is with fired rounds, but it is not when it comes to unspent rounds, and it is not when it comes to unspent rounds with these particular features. These features do not have that strong evidence base, and so it's kind of reaching to quote those error rates when we're basically doing research that is not in line with the studies that produced those error rates. So the match, she reports, is not as strong as she makes out. That's not a spoiler alert, right? Because you guys already knew that. So why are unspent rounds unreliable? I did mention this a little bit before, but it's to do with the fact that if you have not fired that gun, the marks are far fainter and more limited. So there are only faint chambering impressions, things like extractor, ejector, occasional breech face or firing pin drag that could appear. So here we go, extractor and ejector, faint, right? We've got no rifling striations at all. We've got less distinct marks. They're faint, inconsistent, and prone to subclass similarities. We've got a reliability gap. Toolmark analysis is designed for fired rounds, where high-pressure forces leave clearer, more individual signatures. And there are no proficiency tests that exist for unfired cartridge comparisons. Oberg even admitted this in her testimony. So even when we're comparing two unfired rounds to each other, people do try it. Yes, they do. And that's why Oberg is talking about doing that. But it is not validated. But in this case, we are not even comparing two unspent rounds, because remember those 6 cycled unspent rounds? They didn't match at all. We're comparing fired rounds with an unspent round, which clearly there is no proficiency test for. So strong versus weak evidence. There is a lot of repetition here, because it does, I don't know, even as I'm reading it out now to you guys, I'm like, I've got my head around it because I did a lot of research over the last few weeks, so it's quite fresh in my mind, but it's dense. And so I just want to make sure that the key points are coming across. So sorry, apologies if there is a bit of repetition, but hopefully it makes sense. So The gold standard is fired rounds, and it is looking at firing pin impressions, which are clear and reproducible, breech face marks, which enhance detail from the high pressure event of firing the gun, striations from barrel rifling, and validation. Proficiency and validation studies exist only for fired round comparison. So these here, if you do a search for Toolmark analysis, you will see some pretty low error rates, and it may trick you into believing this case is clear cut then. But remember, this is for comparing fired round to fired round, and it's comparing these markings here, neither of which were done with Rick Allen's gun and in this Delphi case. So with unfired rounds, there is weaker evidence. So no full firing pin strike, so there's only possible light contact. We're relying on extractor and ejector marks, which are faint and less distinctive. There are no rifling striations, so the bullet never engages the barrel, and there's limited validation. So it's less reproducible and there's much higher risk of error. And as I said, I could not find a peer-reviewed research study that actually looked at this. But it doesn't stop there. We need to look even further at why this methodology is so problematic. So when Oberg tested Rick Allen's gun, she received his pistol along with a magazine of 15 federal caliber cartridges. I didn't actually change this because this is an error here. So she didn't use the federal 40 caliber rounds to test his gun. She did actually use the Winchester, which is the same as the unspent round. So I will correct this in the presentation, guys. This is incorrect here. She didn't use this ammunition. She used the correct ammunition, which is the Winchester. The reason that matters is because different ammunition is also going to potentially have different markings because of the material used for different types of ammunition. So clearly they look at the unspent rounds or the ammunition before they even cycle it or fire it. So if there are individual differences in the bullet, they would rule that out to begin with anyway. But the bigger issue here is that different materials are used for bullets. So they have nickel casing, I think they have steel casing, and some metals are softer and maybe more prone to markings than others. So realistically, again, you'd want to be using the same ammunition if we're going to compare rounds. And she did do that in this case. So that is incorrect what I've written here. She did actually use the right type of ammunition. But here's where it gets a bit shady. I don't mean she's shady, but it means that the science here is a bit shady. She tested 4 rounds from Allen's gun, and she examined those cartridge cases under both a stereoscope and a comparison microscope. So she tested 4 rounds fired, and then she performed 6 unfired cycled rounds. I think she probably did these first, and then because they did not produce strong enough marks, she fired 4. Okay, so she admitted she did not use the cycled rounds, that's the unfired rounds, to reach her conclusions because they did not mark well enough for comparison. So remember, comparing unspent round to unspent round did not provide strong enough marks for any sorts of conclusions or comparison to be made. So straight away, the apples versus apples comparison is out. Even after 6, right? So she tried 6 times and wasn't able to do it. So she then test fired 4 rounds, and she relied on those because they produced clearer marks. So as I've mentioned, and I'll say it again, and this is taken from Eric Warren, who was a defense expert testimony, and he said she's comparing apples with oranges. It's not the same thing. You can't say, well, close enough. Yeah, they're both fruit, but they're not the same. So the research supporting reliability and validity of Toolmark analysis involves comparisons of fired rounds. Studies specifically focused on unspent rounds are very, very limited, and established error rates for those comparisons are not well defined. There is absolutely no evidence comparing unspent and spent rounds, and this practice is recognised as problematic and unreliable for individualisation. Okay, so the ideal is fired to fired. We don't have that in this case. There is no fired round at the crime scene. It was unfired. If she had managed to establish a conclusion based on unspent rounds, so the cycled rounds matched the unspent round, that would still be questionable, but okay, There is some limited evidence to suggest that that's at least comparing apples with apples. But when we get down to this apples with oranges comparison, there is no evidence for this at all, and it is recognized as problematic and unreliable. So these are actually just statements from her actual testimony, just to really point out what she's done. So she said the test-fired rounds had additional markings that were available, so I'm getting the complete picture when I'm seeing them fired versus cycled. Well, yeah, of course you are, because fired rounds are going to show stronger markings because of the pressure in them being fired. They're not the same in depth and actual availability of them, but it's not that they're different. It's that they did not mark as well. So she's kind of trying to there say, well, it's the same. It's just that they're deeper when they're fired. Yeah, perhaps, but a bit questionable, because Toolmark analysis research validates comparisons of fired rounds. This is where these low error rate stats come from, not from the comparison of unspent and fired rounds. So major issue here, we have weak marks. So Oberg's conclusion relied solely on secondary and weak, not that weak, the other weak marks. So the extractor, ejector, and chamber, and these marks are variable, they're less studied, they're not highly validated when compared to the firing pin or breech face, which is what those low error rates are based on. Sufficient agreement is another major issue because it has no numerical or statistical threshold. Determinations rest on the examiner's judgment, not objective metrics. This is what we were talking about before. And yes, there was a second rater who agreed, but this is one of Oberg's colleagues. We've got lack of reproducibility. So true science means repeated results under the same conditions. But we know that repeatedly, she did not find a match to Rick's gun. And even with the fired rounds, you'll notice I mentioned before she fired 4 rounds and used them to compare and come to her conclusions. But guess what? We don't know how many of those fired rounds actually matched, because she wasn't able to tell us. It shouldn't require so many rounds to find a match. And was it even replicated on more than one round? So here we've got 6 rounds, didn't match. She then fires 4. How many of those matched? We don't know. So here we go. This is some of the testimony from the trial. So the defense asks, you didn't offer up any information about what you found on each of those 6 cycled rounds, did you? And she says, I summarized it. I didn't use them to draw my conclusions, but I didn't say that they were dissimilar. So we don't know what those 6 cycled rounds looked like. Were they, was there any similarity? Were they completely different? We have no idea. So you had 6 rounds in front of you, cycled them all through item 314, which is the gun, and you don't know what rounds had what marks. And she says, I know by the evaluation of looking at them, but I don't specifically say 1, 2, 3, 4 had it or so forth. No. Why not? So how many rounds matched? She describes sufficient agreement between test fire and the crime scene round, but at no point stated that this was found on all 4 test fires or more than one. The test fires were evaluated against each other and then compared to the cartridge from the crime scene, but she did not specify in her report which or how many test-fired rounds showed sufficient agreement. And when she was pressed to specify whether all 4 or just some of the test-fired rounds matched, she never affirmed that all, or if 4 rounds matched, or if all 4 of them matched, or did she summarize them all together because she found little bits and pieces of matches on them. It's so hard to know. She says she summarized them collectively and did not perform or document an individual match analysis for each specific test-fired round. And this is major, right? Like, what? So it could literally be 1 in 10 rounds that matched Rick's gun. Or it could be that the 4 amalgamated together matched Rick's gun, but no one specifically did. It's so hard to know. It makes no sense. So, yeah, was it 1 of the 10 that matched? Was it 4 of the 10? I don't think it was 4 of the 10 because they would have wanted to post that on a billboard. I should have checked this. Wanted that post. I know, yeah, have wanted that posted on a billboard. How did she summarize the 4 rounds? Like, so what was similar? What was different? And I just ask, how is this considered a reliable science? Like I said, if this is the sort of science I did in my honours undergraduate thesis, I would have failed. This is not reliable. So here's another major issue. There was such unfair comparisons because while she did test other guns, she ruled them out with far less rigorous testing. So they weren't subjected to the same conditions that Rick's were. And we'll talk about that in a second. And remember how I mentioned before that you should be comparing to another gun of the same model, ideally? Well, she didn't do that. So here are the other guns. So I think these were other potential people of interest back in 2017, and she tested these guns back then. So with this one, it was a Glock 40 caliber. She tested, fired, and cycled who knows how many. She didn't tell us which ammunition she used, and her findings were that different ejector position, shape, there was no class or individual similarity, and so she said that wasn't a match. Then she tested Smith & Wesson gun, and again, we don't know exactly how many rounds she did, were they fired and cycled, how many times. Again, she used similar rounds, but they had a different head stamp, so not completely comparable. And she found an oval ejector, chamber marks that were reproducible within the gun, but absent on the unspent round, found at the crime scene. So again, said probably not a match. And this is the closest we've got to Rick's gun, which was a Sig Sauer P239. Is this Brad Weber's gun? I feel like I've heard that, but maybe not. Don't quote me on that. So here she fired and cycled, I think 6 rounds. They were Winchester cartridges, but different head stamp from the unspent round found at the crime scene. So again, not directly comparable. And she found some similar class characteristics. So those are characteristics that all Sig Sauers of that model would have in common, I think. But ejector showed heavy subclass marks, not on the unspent round. So it suggests that this gun and the gun that was used to fire the crime scene round would have probably been different based on the subclass comparison. And so she said it was inconclusive, but she couldn't identify or exclude it. Now, really, really interesting here because we have 6 cartridges in this case. Don't know how many were fired or cycled, and she gave up after 6. But with Rick's, she did 10. So Oberg did not test a second non-Richard Allen Sig Sauer P226, and so not comparing the crime scene cartridge against another P226 or a set of consecutively produced P226s is a limitation, particularly when subclass characteristics are a known risk in this type of examination. And she mentioned there were subclass characteristics when it came to Rick Allen's guns and the test fires. The ideal protocol would include this step to ensure that the observed markings are truly individual and not shared by other guns of the same make, model, batch due to manufacturing subclass carryover. So this is a totally unfair comparison. A fair scientific comparison would require equal testing conditions. Allen's gun got more tests, which means more rolls of the dice. And so by sheer probability, the more you cycle or fire, the more chance you'll see at least one spurious similarity. So the jury here is, we found a match on Allen's gun, not on the others. But the reality is, Allen's gun was given 10 tries and the others weren't. And if she'd stopped after 6, like she did with the other Sig Sauer, maybe she would have been inconclusive or excluded Allen's gun too. The only reason she got a match is because she kept going till at least one, because we don't know how many of them, at least one of the 10 looked good enough to call it. So this is not good science. It's like saying, I ran 10 blood tests, 9 said negative and 1 said positive, and I'm going to call it positive and ignore the 9 negatives. Now, okay, it may be more than one. It may be that multiple of those, maybe it was 4 positive to 6 negative. That's still not the best statistic. But in this case, I don't believe it was 4, because if it was 4, she would have told us, right? or the state would have told us. So this is not science, it's bias. Nobody is going to go and, buy baby clothes because 1 out of their 10 pregnancy tests showed a positive result, right? So this is not reliable science, not the way that it was used in this case. It's a forensic technique being applied in a way that overstates its certainty while totally ignoring its inconsistency. Just going back to this point, because I didn't put it in the slides, but I remember hearing, and I do believe it was in the testimony, Oberg says that she's never been wrong. That's a pretty bold statement, first of all, but let's say that's even true. How many times has she compared unspent rounds to fired rounds before, first of all? Because maybe she's never been wrong because she's only actually compared spent rounds with each other, which is what the science tells you to do. And then the next question I have for her is, how do you know you've never been wrong? Because how does she know she's not wrong in this case? I mean, she would say she was right in this case because there's a conviction that's occurred, but we don't necessarily know that that's because she's right. It's basically circular reasoning, I think, right? I'm trying to think of what the reasoning is. It's like me saying, I'm always right about whether people are guilty or not because they're found guilty. But that doesn't mean they were guilty. That just means they were found guilty. This is not something that can be tested with, DNA to go, see, you're right. So like if I said, well, I know that I'm always right because every time I've thought someone was guilty, a DNA test showed that there was a 1 in 7 billion chance that anybody else could be the offender. Well, that's accurate. I'm pretty accurate then, particularly if I've done that over thousands of tests like she says she has. But in this case, when do we get the black and white answer that what she saw was right? I just think it's a very bold statement. Okay, so that brings us to the Oregon court decision on Toolmark analysis. And this was the article that Diana, who is one of my wonderful mods and buddies in this community, sent to me. And this was a decision that was very recent in June 2025. It was the Oregon Court of Appeals, State versus Adams. And the court ruled that the Toolmark analysis method, and this Toolmark analysis method was the validated method of comparing spent casings to testified casings. So this is the oranges to oranges or apples to apples. So this is the way it's meant to be with the low error rates. But they actually said it was not shown to be scientifically valid. And they had concerns around subjectivity, a lack of established error rates, and uncertain reproducibility across examiners. And they said, no, this doesn't stand. So this basically reflects a growing judicial skepticism about Toolmark analysis, despite its widespread use. So I think it's a little bit probably like polygraph, right? Like polygraphs are not particularly reliable as far as I remember studying in forensic psychology all those years back, and yet they're still used, right? There are things that people still use even though they're no longer valid, and sometimes it's for effect, I suppose, if that makes sense. It's almost like it's got it's not really like a placebo effect, but yeah, kind of like I think most of us are going to think if we're doing a polygraph, I'll just admit it. I've never committed a crime, but I would imagine if I'd be like, okay, I've done this and I'm saying I didn't, they're going to catch me on the polygraph. Okay, fine, I did it, So I kind of feel like it's more like a psychological tool in a sense. Anyway, so in Rick's case, the comparison is weaker than in this State versus Adams case. We're looking at not a spent versus a spent, not even an unspent versus an unspent. We're looking at a spent versus unspent. And so the Oregon ruling was on the more valid method, let alone this. So this would be even more vulnerable under this same reasoning. And why does it matter? Because appeals are harder than trials. At trial, judges usually let forensic evidence in, but on appeal, the bar is higher. Courts rarely overturn trial judges on admissibility. And so if, in this case, the Oregon Court of Appeals felt, actually, you know what, we're going to overturn this decision, like this is not okay, then this means it was a serious issue. And this has serious ramifications when it comes to other people's cases, like Rick's. So Oregon broke with tradition. The Court of Appeals did rule that the standard toolmark analysis was not scientifically valid or reliable. But this is unusual because that doesn't usually happen. Usually appellate judges do not overturn trial judges' decisions. But in this case, they did. So it definitely shifts or signals a shift in judicial skepticism. So the implications for Rick, if even the strongest type of comparison failed on appellate review, then we would hope that in Rick's appeal, which is hopefully upcoming, that the toolmark analysis that was used in his conviction was based on the weakest type of evidence, and therefore it should be even more vulnerable to reliability issues and therefore seen as a significant appellate issue. So the big picture, this isn't just about one case, it's about the credibility of toolmark analysis worldwide, and the Oregon decision gives the defense teams powerful precedent to challenge similar evidence. So just a couple of final notes before we finish up the discussion of the gun and the bullet. Here is the memory box or hope box in Rick's house where they said that they found a round that was the same type as the crime scene round. So I think earlier I mentioned that they seized his gun and some different, I think it was Blazer or Federal, I don't know if that's the same type of ammunition, excuse my ignorance there, but that the crime scene round was different to that. It was a Winchester, and that's what Oberg used to test his gun. Well, they said they found a Winchester round in here, and the implication that they made then is that he was keeping that as a trophy. You know, he had a similar round, he's keeping it as a trophy, or at the very least, see, he had the same ammunition as what was found at the crime scene. So this is slam dunk, you know, he's guilty. What a horrible, evil man, because he's even kept it as a trophy in his little memory box. Now, first of all, this just looks like a junk box. Like, no offense to Rick, we all have one of these, but he's just chucked multiple things in here. It doesn't look like it's some beautiful treasured box from his, you know, wedding and memories and things like that. It's just bits and pieces, right? Like, you know, we've got some old watches in here. We've got whatever this is in the sandwich bag. We've got like junk. I'm sorry. This is just the things you don't know where to put in your house and you just chuck them in a drawer or in a box. Got lots of these around my house. So firstly that. Secondly, look at it. This is the bullet here. I mean, you can barely see it, right? Blink and you'll miss it. But look at how it's sitting. It's sitting up straight. I don't know about you, but that looks suspicious to me. So I said, and I know this sounds like conspiracy here, but remember, police tampering does occur. It's not as rare as you would think. Sure, it's not commonplace. I'm not saying most police tamper with evidence, but it certainly is not a completely woo-woo theory here. This looks oddly placed. If you're chucking things, look at how these things are chucked. Nothing's neatly placed, but this just happens to sit up nice and straight. It hasn't fallen on its side. It's not chucked on other things. It's been placed in this really, you know, careful, straight up way. Come on, really? It's also a little bit convenient, I think, to be honest. Anyway, but when you've got a very weak case and you're looking for things to match, sometimes maybe some people feel like there's a need to place things that match. These are all alleged. I don't have proof. The fact is as well, this is common ammunition anyway. Other people have this ammunition. It's not a rare type of bullet or round, right? So big deal. I think they found another round somewhere else, like in his wardrobe, and it just wasn't matching to the Winchester round. So it wasn't seen as such a big deal. But like, look, again, I don't have a gun. I've never had a gun. We're not allowed to have guns here in Australia without a license, and I have no intention to have one. But I'm pretty sure if you could, you'd probably find these everywhere. Like what we are allowed to have here in Australia is Nerf guns, and my kids have those. And we find those little Nerf bullets everywhere. We have them in drawers, in memory boxes, not memory boxes, but we definitely have them in our junk drawer, which is a drawer that has like old watches and old phones and bits and pieces like Rick's box there has. And I can absolutely tell you that on occasion I have found Nerf bullets there. So I'm going to guess that this isn't super odd. And finally, and this is where the psychology comes in again, it doesn't make sense. Why would he want to keep a reminder of the mistake he made forensically at the crime scene? Because if he knows he dropped the bullet at the crime scene, he knows, because apparently he's super clever, right? Because he's managed to evade law enforcement for 5 years and, you know, not leave any DNA evidence and, you know, not get caught. But he's left this bullet there. So he knows that links to him, because there's also, I believe, no fingerprints on that bullet or DNA. So he's clever enough to have wiped all of that evidence off it, but left it there. But he's then not clever enough to go, I probably shouldn't keep another round like that in my memory box at home. What? And if he doesn't know he dropped it there, then why would the round have any significance? He didn't use the gun to actually perpetrate the crime. So it's not a trophy. It's not related to the crime, unless we say, yes, okay, well, the gun was used to scare the girls. But even then the gun would be the trophy, right? Not the round. It's just, it's beyond any logic. It doesn't make sense. This would be incredibly unusual. It doesn't make any valid sense here. And it kind of goes, again, hand in hand with he got rid of the 2017 phone. Because as I've said over and over again, if he is deviant the way that he has been presented, which I don't believe he is, then he wasn't just deviant in the few years that he owned that phone. All of his phones would have something questionable on them, only guess what? They didn't. So it just feels a little convenient. It feels a little convenient that that round is found there. It feels a little convenient that the 2017 phone is missing, because that phone potentially could have shown his whereabouts on the day and his activity on the day. And I'm willing to probably bet some pretty good money on the fact that if we ever found that phone, which we won't now, that it would have actually been exculpatory. I just think in this case, you can't put much past law enforcement. And then the final piece of this equation, and I'm thinking again about what people who believe Rick Allen's guilty say when it comes to the gun and the bullet. And they say, well, his confession included the bullet, so it must be significant. He said he did something funny with the gun and he dropped a bullet. So there you go. That proves it. Well, first of all, the bullet was not found on the south side of the Monon High Bridge where the girls were abducted. And he says he did something with the gun when he was getting the girls, not at the crime scene. So first of all, there is no way that bullet then fell out there, but then somehow flew across to the crime scene. But okay, even if we say maybe he misspoke and maybe he racked the gun at the crime scene and that's when the bullet fell out, well, guess what? Memory is suggestible, as I've said before. And he already knew that they found a bullet at the scene. He was told that by Holman. Can we remember that painful interrogation video where the only person who looks scary is not Rick Allen in that room? No offense, but he knows that the bullet matching supposedly is what has sealed his fate here, you know, as being arrested. He knows about a bullet being involved in this case. That's what they drilled into him. And so, of course, he has that in his mind. So when he decompensates and is really, like spiraling, which we're going to talk about more in the psychology part of this case, then of course that detail becomes part of the false narrative, right? This is memory contamination. For goodness sakes, we could all do that. Like we start remembering something as being part of the story, even though it actually wasn't part of the story, but someone else told us that. It's like when my kids will be like, oh, I so remember that day. And I'm like, no, you don't. You were 3. You can't remember when you were 3. Yes, I can. It's like, no, you remember the photo or you remember what I told you. And it's like Chinese whispers. The story evolved based on what you're told, right? And there's research that's been done around this, around like big events that happen, like JFK's assassination, the day Princess Diana died, where people do not have a very accurate memory of that day, but they feel like they do because they've combined information that they've heard from other sources over the years. So this confession detail, it's not relevant. His mind has pieced everything together Think about it this way. He had 6 months while he was in prison and he wasn't in that psychotic state to mull over what on earth was happening here. And you see it in that interrogation video where he has no idea how on earth a bullet from his gun has ended up at the crime scene near the girls. He has no idea whatsoever. He is absolutely dumbfounded, as is Kathy. On that note, because I think it's relevant, if we go back to that interrogation too, do you notice that he doesn't even try to make up any lies? He doesn't even try to be sneaky and say, oh, well, yeah, I did hunt in that area before. Like, Holman literally throws him that bone. Obviously, we know he's not doing it to be kind. He's doing it to try and trip Rick up. He says, did you lend your gun out? You know, did you go hunting there? Did you shoot a snake? And Rick's like, no, why would you shoot a snake? Again, there's one person in that room that says some pretty despicable things, and it isn't Rick. I don't like snakes. I'm phobic of snakes, but like, really? Like, shooting a snake comes to mind? Like, I don't know. I mean, I don't have a gun. I don't go near snakes. Maybe people do shoot snakes, but ugh. Rick looks actually pretty shocked at that point. It's like, no. Anyway, all I'm saying there is that he doesn't try to cover his tracks when it comes to the bullet evidence, when realistically, if he's this clever mastermind that got away with this crime for 5 years and left, you know, no evidence at the scene other than this unspent round with no DNA and fingerprints on it, like, come on. He's going to not then say, oh, yeah, I think I lent my gun to so-and-so, or actually, I did lose my gun for a period of time, or, oh, yeah, I used to go hunting in the woods, and yeah, you're right, I did shoot a snake. Like, come on. So anyway, I'm getting emotional, guys. I get emotional about this. So as always, we'll end with beautiful Daisy. Here she is, watching over us, saying, keep going, guys, fight the good fight. Here's all of the links to anything to do with me and my activities in this case. You guys probably already know this. Follow me in any of these. And yeah, like, by all means, join the discussion. Let me know what you think. And yeah, give me any feedback. If there's anything I'm incorrect on, I did, as we were going through the slides, like I said, there were a few little things that I'm going to touch up and fix, because I get so tired of checking, and I'm like so perfectionistic that eventually I'm just like, stop, can't check anymore. But I still have some blind spots in there. So I will fix those up, but I did correct them as we went through. One other thing I'm going to look back at, I realized as I was talking it through, was back here when we had the quotes from Oberg. She's talking about the cycled rounds, the 6 ones here, not the 4 ones. So I think initially I interpreted that as her not knowing which rounds of the 4 matched, but now I read it back, I thought it said 6. But I do believe still this stands, that she didn't say specifically which ones showed sufficient agreement, but I'll double check that. If that's incorrect, I will absolutely put a pinned comment on here, but I will also be doing another video on this more formally for the other channel. So if there are errors in any of my videos, I will try to correct them on, like, as a pinned comment or in the description or in the community or all of the above, because I'm a checker who likes to make sure that I've covered all bases, but I didn't check this well enough. Apologies. But I'll also always, as my ideas evolve, I post new videos. So even if you go back a few months, you will see videos where the overall gist is the same, because I pretty much haven't made any videos where I believe Rick is guilty. There were a few really early on where I didn't know. That was during the trial where I was on the fence. But subsequently, I've made a fair amount of videos around his innocence, but my views have certainly evolved over time. So there will be some things that have dropped off from previous videos, and then there'll be some things that have changed slightly, and there'll be some things I've added. So if you see inconsistencies between something back a few months ago and now, it's because my opinion has evolved, and you basically, I would say, trust the most recent content. And I'm going to keep posting probably fairly repetitively over time, because eventually I'm going to run out of new stuff to talk about. In this case, I'm covering all of the main angles, but no doubt I will cover this angle again in the future, not to be repetitive and annoying, but to kind of make sure that any new viewers coming through are finding out this information. Remember, the goal of this is to really increase awareness of the flaws in this case, and so we want to reach a wider audience. Absolutely. So the more times that I do videos and I produce more content, the more likely it is that each time someone new may see it. And that's certainly been the case so far. We've had this steady increase in subscribers. This channel, as you can tell, is not for any financial benefit for me, because I only have a small amount of followers. But even as I have more followers, if I ever got to that point of any sort of monetization with the Rick Allen channel, I really don't think that I'd be using it for anything other than maybe paying for some of the resources that I use, like, you know, being able to use better systems to record and make my voice sound more easily to listen to, and get rid of my lisp and things like that. But yeah, and I don't ever anticipate earning lots of money from this channel. It's a niche area. It's not something that is meant to be done to earn money. So when I'm trying to bring more people in, it's not to get extra funds or clicks. It's to, I mean, everybody likes extra clicks. I'm always honest about that. It is so nice to know that people are listening and interested in what I have to say. There is validation in that. But the most important thing here is making sure that there is wider understanding of what's happened in this case, and also what happens in many cases, because this case has really opened my eyes. I was never super interested in wrongful convictions. I've been interested in true crime, but never really got caught up in wrongful convictions until this case, because this case has convinced me and helped me to really kind of dig into what really happens and realize, actually, we can't always trust that justice is served. I think I was naive, and now my eyes have opened. And this is not conspiracy. This is based on evidence. There are cases of wrongful conviction, clearly, and there are cases of wrongdoings of law enforcement in prosecuting people. So anyway, without further ado, we'll finish up for today. Thank you so much for watching. This is pre-recorded. I may or may not be in the chat with you guys when you're watching this. So if I'm not, thank you to my mods, Shibby, Hebby, Diana, Mino Dino, wonderful, amazing people who've become my friends only over the last few months through me doing this YouTube stuff. I met most of them in Prof's chat, so shout out to Prof as well. Thank you guys for being so supportive and always kind and warm and welcoming to me. And thanks everybody for joining into the conversation, for subscribing, for liking, for chatting. I know we don't always all agree in terms of our opinions or the specifics of our ideas, but it's such a respectful, beautiful community, and that is all I ask for. So really appreciate it. Thank you guys. I will speak to you soon. Bye.